Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amit and I have $27,000 invested into Palantir, which is why we are going to be doing another video on some due diligence for Palantir. Okay, today we're talking about AML, which is not anti-machine learning or anything to do with machine learning. It's actually anti-money laundering. And we're going to talk about what anti-money laundering is. We're going to talk about sort of the history of anti-money laundering in the United States and ultimately what it relates to when it comes to agencies working with banks and operators and governments to stop anti-money laundering, because it's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. And what Palantir's role in anti-money laundering operations are. Now, the quick overall thesis here is that I think this is going to be a gigantic market for Palantir as the global economic competitive markets become more intense, more decentralized to some extent, and more centralized, given we're going to see which startups ultimately succeed when it comes to financial technologies. And we're going to talk about what Palantir can offer in terms of its services for anti-money laundering when working with some of the biggest banks and hedge funds and governments in the world. So, first of all, what is money laundering? Money laundering is when people are able to take money and launder it. Launder it meaning they're able to steal it or they're able to use it in a particular way. They're basically able to create some type of financial crime, right? And that financial crime is hard to detect. It's hard for institutions to detect. Institutions, banks pay billions and billions of dollars every year to either agencies or in-house they use to develop systems and organizations. Fraud departments are very strong. Airbnb uses fraud departments. Coinbase's fraud departments. Pretty much every startup has some level of fraud departments if you're processing money in any sense, because there's always organizations, groups of organizations, different individuals, terrorists potentially that are trying to use your service to launder money, to get money from one place to another, or to steal money from one account to another, but to not make it seem like it's being stolen in the first place, right? That's where these types of organizations come in place. That's where these organizations are important. And that's where data analytics and software analyzation ultimately comes incredibly important to be able to fight financial crime. So on their website, they say financial crime is harder than ever for institutions to detect. And with digital transformation accelerating sophisticated attacks and new unregulated digital assets like cryptocurrencies heightening risk exposure, Palantir software is trusted by banking giants, up-and-coming fintechs, and regulators alike, leveraging military-grade security with best-in-class architecture. Best-in-class architecture is the way the software is actually used for the end user that is trying to make sure that this money laundering doesn't happen. And the military-grade security comes from Palantir's history of working with the government and actually being able to protect data and make sure it's private, make sure it's secure. So when they say they're trusted by banking giants, we're talking about I don't know if these are true, but like your Chase, JP Morgan, Bank of America, these are sort of the banking giants that exist that most likely use some level of Palantir software in some capacity. Up and coming fintechs, these are like the Stripes of the world that I think Stripe is valued at like $95 billion in its IPO when it goes public. So it's going to be a very big IPO, and regulators as well. So they say Palantir solves for transaction monitoring, investigations, and financial intelligence units. Know your customer laws, which is basically the ability for a bank to know who the customer is and how the transaction is happening. That's commonly referred to as KYC. Customer and transaction risk ratings, sanction screening, and enhanced and customer due diligence. So the real thing that they say here is that Foundry for AML has allowed global financial organizations to lower their costs by 90% and improve their true positive rate by 45%. True positive rate is the ability for them to actually make sense of the data and to make sure that they're decreasing the level of crime that's happening. And their cost by 90%. What goes into the costs? There's a lot of costs. You have to spend money on the talent to be able to actually make sense of the data when you have a financial crime that's reported. You have to investigate it. You have to report it to the authorities. You have to do due diligence on the crime that is happening, which means you have to spend a lot of time and resources that could be allocated to other things to make the business better in order to prevent this fraud or to make sense of this fraud that's happening. So there's a ton of costs that happen when and not to mention the money you have to pay back if there is an actual fraud and there's like millions of dollars stolen. You have to make your customer whole or you make your client whole for that because they trusted you with that money. So there's a variety of different costs that go into fraud, which is why corporations are, they spend billions of dollars to get rid of those costs because those costs end up biting them back in the ass later as it happens. Foundry cuts investigative time in half while improving risk posture and relationships with the regulators. Heavily regulated environment, especially financial services, especially when you're talking about anti-money laundering. So very, very important thing for Foundry to be able to resolve that. Now, what does it actually do? Financial institutions need to comprehensively understand the behavior of their customers. This is sort of the key thing that happens when it comes to a financial institution. When you have customers, you're going to have some good apples, some bad apples. You need to understand the way your customers interact with your service and with your software at scale. You need to also understand the related networks that exist within your ecosystem in order to make sense of how customers are using your product. Foundry for AML is a regulator-approved approach, regulator-approved is very important, to improving your AML risk posture by deploying next-generation AI. This is sort of the basis for what Palantir says. We're not AI, we're next generation AI, based anti-money laundering and compliance processes within days. And these are the 4 things that Palantir says sets them apart, or 5 things. A powerful AI foundation, holistic risk-based models and scenarios. That's really important, what we're going to talk about. Governmental approved security, best-in-class investigative tooling and reportive, and no, there were 4 things. Okay, so I was right about 4 things. So let's talk about the first one, powerful AI foundations. Palantir's machine learning-based entity resolution and advanced network-based risk models enable easy and accurate linking of customers, networks, and unknown counterparties. That means its ability to integrate all the different things I talked about that goes into a company's ability to prevent fraud, all happen in a centralized hub. This empowers the bank with a solid, future-proof foundation and a central client file. This would be like the centralized hub, a customer 360 reporting dashboard that can be updated dynamically across AML functions. So if you're thinking about a bank that's trying to understand its AML functions within an institution, you're talking about a system that can now be integrated that allows you to search through all the data sets you have and make sense of all the data that you have in one place to be able to understand how to optimize AML scenarios. Second is holistic risk-based models and scenarios. Palantir's solution takes a hybrid approach, providing comprehensive out-of-the-box modules, scenarios, and models while offering the flexibility needed to meet regulatory demands driven by your precise customer base and risk tolerance. Ultimately, this improves alert accuracy and efficiency while providing more high-quality automated reports for regulators. Now, if you're a bank or an institution that works with any form of finance, banks are a big thing, right? You have to be regulated. If you're processing money, if you're sending money, if you're holding money, there's the Federal Reserve rates. There's all these things that go into actually being able to make sure that the bank or that you are compliant with regulations in a heavy regulated industry. If you are able to create more models and scenarios that are able to reduce your risk or understand the risk tolerance of the organization based upon data sets that are able to integrate within your entire AML systems, then that's a huge holistic scenario or holistic use case for how Palantir can operate or integrate within your bank, which is really important. And it's also important to understand that the flexibility of these out-of-the-box solutions, because they're using next-generation AI, matches what regulators are looking for, which is the third thing, right? Governmental approved security. Initially, Palantir was built for governmental intelligence and defense agencies, but now Palantir Foundry includes unparalleled granular security controls across all organizations, which is, again, why I think the stock is really interesting, because it can work with all organizations. All data is encrypted both in transit and at rest, and Palantir offers high auditability and role-based access control framework so that all teams can access and share the necessary data without compromising security. This goes back to the sort of non-technical people working at a bank, working to detect fraud, to be able to make sense of all the data that's coming in and to integrate with other departments of the company to make sure that when something happens, there is an immediate, safe way to resolve the issue that is private and that is secure at scale. Finally, they have best-in-class investigative tooling and reporting. So with a holistic understanding across transaction, relationship, counterparty, and know your customer laws, the full network of related entities allows workflow management, which has timely and proper escalation, triage, and review with full collaboration and transparency across all relevant teams. This is so that when teams have to deal with an investigation, which is inevitable, and you have to actually understand how that investigation is going to operate and what are the tools and things you're going to use to make sense of the investigation, that's when you have to ultimately have a holistic understanding across the entire organization. Once an investigation is complete, Palantir generates required reporting information with full data lineage to source systems, updates reports dynamically as information changes, and alerts analysts of new risks. So if you're a risk analyst at like Citibank and your Citibank is using Palantir Foundry, for example, all the reporting that is necessary for you as an analyst to present to your managing directors or to other people comes through the full lineage of how you got that data if it's integrated with Palantir Foundry. And it updates as the information change, right? Like let's say you're detecting fraud in Japan, and then from Japan there's a fraud in India, but that's linked to the fraud in Japan. Like the same organization is laundering the money, for example, from India or Japan, or example. Like those things get updated in real time when you have Palantir Foundry anti-money laundering systems in place, which is just really important for organizations, especially risk analysts that are trying to make sense of what's ultimately going on. Now, what does this mean for the stock? I think this means a couple things. Number one, that anti-money laundering is a massive business. The reason it's a massive business is because there's always going to be bad people in the world. Like when we stop having bad people in the world, we probably won't have anti-money laundering problems, or we won't have money laundering problems. But as long as we have those, and as long as banks are big, and as long as there's a lot of money stored in banks, you need to fight off the bad guys. And fighting off the bad guys requires having intense level of analytics and data to make sense of the bad things that are happening in real time. And then when you're able to make sense of the bad things that are happening in real time, you're able to better understand why that's happening and have more efficient outcomes to stop what is happening, which is going back to how they reduced 90% of their costs in the use cases that have happened and ultimately became 45 times more faster. I think in terms of the stock, I say this in every video, but that's sort of the conclusion of a lot of these things as I analyze them. It increases the TAM, right? As you're working with more and more organizations across the world, let's say Palantir works with a bunch of US banks. What happens when every single bank in the world uses Palantir? Again, every single person, institution, organization, nonprofit, profit company uses Google because they've got to get information. Data becoming the new oil means all these organizations, whether it's energy, blockchain, banks, financial crimes, whatever it is, are using data to make sense of that data. What is going to actually integrate and make sense of that data? That's the long-term trajectory. This is why I think Kathy Woods put $1 billion into the company, right? Because if that ultimately, again, AML is just another use case. If that ultimately becomes something that scales across the entire world, where Palantir is in every single bank or central intelligence agency within all governments across the world to stop money laundering, to fight against terrorism and financial crimes, you're talking about actually saving people's lives, saving people's money, and having a stock price that probably, again, not financial advice, but is likely to go higher because you're getting so many more contracts with different governments that you're operating with, right? Again, not financial advice. This is not a reason to buy the stock. This is a reason why I am bullish on the ability for the stock to go more and more into different directions that are positive, because you're working with all these clientele that ultimately need your software, and that it's a sticky software that they're not going to not use as long as it's been effective for them and it's saving them 90% of the cost that they have when it comes to these things. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. This is Palantir for anti-money laundering. I'm going to leave some links in the description that gives you a little bit more sense of how I got this information and where it's coming from and what it means to fight the future of financial crime. Thank you guys for watching. As always, look forward to reading the comments. My name is Mitt. This is the Daily Business Show, and I'll see you in the next one.